Arguably, one of the most famous, or maybe one of the most infamous events in history, depending on your perspective, is the destruction of Carthage by the Romans. Carthage was the great Mediterranean rival to Rome during that city's rise to power, and three wars, known collectively as the Punic Wars, were fought between the two powers between 264 and 146 BC, ending with Carthage's final defeat and eventual destruction. And arguably one of the best known facts about the final destruction of that city is that the Romans plowed and salted the earth so that nothing could ever grow there again. It seems, however, that this famous event never actually happened. So, if that's the case, then how has this make-believe event become so famous? How do we know it did not happen? And if it didn't, then what actually occurred? That last question is the easiest of the three to deal with. Of the three Punic Wars, we know the least about the third one, in large part because our sources are comparatively scarce. We do know that the historian Polybius, who was friends with the Roman general Scipio Aemilianus, saw the events himself and wrote a history of the Punic Wars. And this is, in theory, probably our most extensive account, but segments of it have been lost. Every other source we have from antiquity was written after the Third Punic War, and it either draws upon Polybius as its main source, or it employs other source material that does not appear to be Polybius's writings, but none of those sources survive in complete forms except the history of Appian, dating to the 2nd century AD. Details differ on some events, but concerning the destruction of the city, we know that in the spring of 146 BC, Roman forces breached the defenses, and then over the next week, they burned most of the city, killed most of the people they found, and once that was done, the remaining Carthaginians either surrendered or set their main temple on fire and perished in the flames. After that, the surviving Carthaginians were mostly sold into slavery. The city was then actively demolished for the most part, with Scipio and a 10-man committee from the Roman Senate overseeing all of it. That is what we know for certain. There is no mention in the surviving sources about the Third Punic War and about the destruction of Carthage, about salting the land either around the city or in the city itself. It does not appear to have actually happened, or if it did, no surviving source makes any mention of it. And this then leads us to the next two questions. Where exactly then did this idea come from, and how do we know that? And lastly, let's say, just for the sake of argument, that the Romans did salt the earth around Carthage. What were they trying to accomplish? So, for the rest of this video, if anybody wants to do some further digging on the matter, I'm drawing on R.T. Ridley's article to be taken with a pinch of salt, The Destruction of Carthage, and Dexter Hoyos' book, The Carthaginians. This idea seems to start showing up in the medieval period, and then really takes off, as so much else did, in the 19th century. Now, this is not to say that salting the earth never happened, it very much did, but it's not in a Carthaginian or a Roman context. Instead, the idea of the destruction of Carthage seems to have at some point become conflated with the destruction of cities mentioned in the Old Testament and in Assyrian documents. Two Assyrian kings, Adad-nirari and Shalmaneser, both dating to the 1200s BC, are documented as having sacked and burned cities, and then after, they plowed the earth and they sowed it with something called kudimu. We don't know what kudimu is, but given the context, it's either salt or something like it. Most famously, perhaps, we have the account of the destruction of Shechem, as recorded in the Book of Judges, where the city is razed and the land is sown with salt. The salting of the earth was associated with Carthage, probably due to biblical imagery such as this. It is strictly a modern idea that has no basis in any Roman-era primary source about the destruction of the city. But salting the earth is recorded in Near Eastern sources, although not Roman ones. So what would the point of this have been? For the sake of argument, let's just say that the Romans did salt the earth around Carthage. Why go through all the effort? Well, for a city like Carthage, it probably would have been infeasible to have actually rendered the landscape desolate and infertile by salting it. It is possible to kill plants with salt, and earth can be made infertile by applying it, but the amount that would have been needed for the process would have been something like 750,000 tons of salt, which likely would have been a physical impossibility for the Romans at the time. However, Applying salt or something with a high level of salinity can alter the chemical composition of the soil and make agriculture almost impossible. This appears to have been the purpose of salting the earth in Bronze Age Near Eastern cities. Not outright destruction, but changing the composition of the soil just enough to allow something with a higher tolerance, like weeds, to grow as opposed to wheat. The city would not have been obliterated so much as it simply would have been conquered and then returned to wilderness, and it would be as if it had never existed in the first place. So, there you have it. The boring truth about the salting of Carthage.